Our next guest says despite volatility, the U.S. banking sector is sound and resilient. We heard that from PacWest itself, as well as with regard to its business. And Rob Nichols, American Bankers Association CEO and president, is joining us now. Rob, thank you so much for being here. Obviously, I imagine you've been on the phone a lot over the past, taking a lot of meetings over the past several weeks with your members. I want to start with where we stand right now with regard in particular to these regional banks and their soundness. You know, there's obviously been a perception over the past several weeks that these banks are not doing well. Talk to me about that gap between perception and what you see as the reality of how these banks are doing.
Thanks, Julian. Thank you for inviting me today. You teed this up just perfectly. First of all, I'm excited to see the rebound in some of these stocks. When you look at the recent earnings and the fundamentals, they're doing well. These mid-sized banks, these small regional banks are incredibly important for the U.S. economy. They serve incredibly important communities and businesses and individuals. So despite the failures of three institutions that we saw, and that's, of course, unfortunate when any bank fails, and we take that incredibly seriously, the overall sector is safe, sound, resilient, and healthy, from community banks all the way up to our money center banks. But the banks that you're talking about here, again, when you look at the recent earnings, when you look at the fundamentals, they are in solid shape. So obviously, we've been in a period of some turmoil. But a lot of what we've seen, Julie, with regard to those couple of institutions, was really idiosyncratic and local to those institutions, not representative of the entire U.S. banking sector, which is on solid footing.
That said, Rob, is the banking crisis over?
Well, I'll tell you this, things are absolutely stabilizing, and a lot of folks, of course, are looking at the actions of the federal government, Brad, that have occurred over the last several weeks. I think those actions, obviously, there'll be plenty of opportunity to reflect on the long-term implications. That said, I think what the government did to help stabilize the sector, the overall sector, I think were important steps that the Fed and the FDIC and the Treasury Department took. So I think what we've seen over the last several days, I think, has been incredibly encouraging as the dust has been settling. And then people are looking at the safety, the soundness of the overall sector. So we certainly hope we are past the events of several weeks ago and moving into a brighter direction.
How do your members feel about the burden that they are being asked to shoulder versus what the regulators are shouldering or the government is shouldering in this case?
Well, when you mean burden, there's a lot of ways. Julie, what do you mean specifically? Do you mean the assessments? What do you mean exactly when you say
I mean all of it. I mean the assessments. Sure. I mean the money that various banks put in to shore up some of the troubled lenders. I mean JP Morgan then coming in and taking over assets as well. And I wonder if there's any consternation among members as to the increased strength of JP Morgan. I mean, there are a lot of different ways that this could go.
Okay, so let's first talk about the assessments. Yes, there will be. Listen, no bank likes to pay, for the failures of any other bank, of course. But having a risk pool in the form of the deposit insurance fund is incredibly important, and I think has served our nation incredibly well. What's interesting, Julie, is now there's questions about the future of the deposit insurance framework here in the United States. So we're deeply involved in this conversation with our members and with Congress, of course, that would be involved here, and the federal government. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of options. There's a lot of ideas about how we move forward. Do we keep it the way it is? Do we make a deposit insurance unlimited, or do we say perhaps have for business and payroll accounts one system and maybe a different system for others? How banks pay into it is also an incredibly important conversation. So we're in the midst of all of this now. I will say that one of the really important underpinnings of the U.S. economy is our banking system. Keeping it, preserving it, protecting it, keeping it safe and sound is incredibly important. So we're in these conversations with Congress, with the regulators around all of these issues, what the future looks like. It's incredibly important. One thing we haven't talked about yet, though, I think is Julie and Brad, really important to bring up, is some trading that we've seen in some of these institutions, particularly over the last couple of weeks, that kind of defies the recent earning reports defies the underlying fundamentals. And so I was really encouraged. We sent a letter to Chairman of the SEC, Gary Gensler, to say, listen, we need you to look out after, predatory shorting, market manipulation. Short selling in and of itself, of course, incredibly important for price discovery. So we're not anti-short selling, but we've seen some instances around some of these institutions that look awfully suspicious and, quite frankly, fishy. And so we've asked the SEC, the Office of Market Intelligence, to take a look at that and to use all of their enforcement tools to make sure that you're, again, not seeing market manipulation or any sort of predatory shorting, which would be any illegal activity, frankly, that we're awfully concerned about, because some of those share price movements just don't make any sense.
Yeah, I wanted to dig into that a little bit with you. I'm looking at PacWest, which I'm seeing right now has a short interest as a percentage of float still at about 18%. The difficulty, of course, is sussing out what is illegal and what is not. And historically, this has been a tough task for regulators. So, I know that's the job for them and not for you, but, how do you know it's suspicious activity? How do you know when it's illegal?
Yeah, so they do. That's a great question, and it is tricky. So I have some sympathy for the executives at the SEC and the Office of Market Intelligence who are tasked with that. But I'll give you one example. There was one bank that a very reputable media outlet wrote a story suggesting that the bank was for sale, citing a whole bunch of anonymous sources. And the bank CEO came out and said that's just not true. Like, every aspect of this story is just not true. That's the sort of stuff that the SEC needs to investigate and enforce. Again, shorting in and of itself is important, but some of the things that we have seen really just don't make sense. So the SEC has access to a lot of trading information, a lot of data, of course, that we don't at the American Bankers Association. But I was encouraged when Chairman Gary Gensler just last week on Friday put out a statement that said they're monitoring the markets very, very closely and looking out for any sort of bad actors who are engaging in improper activity.
Rob, thanks so much for your time this morning. Rob Nichols, American Bankers Association CEO and president. Of course, we're going to continue to track all of this. Thank you, Rob.